Kavasseur and Jimmy Price here. Take a seat next to us around the Tanoa and let's have a shell and talk Kava.
Welcome to the Kava Lounge. It's Jimmy and Douglas. We're here talking about Dr. J.D. Baker and his paper called
Pills, potions, products. Kava's transformation in new and non-traditional contexts.
Thank you, Doug.
It's from the Journal of the Contemporary Pacific, volume 24, number 2, published in 2012.
And a very interesting paper. It actually has pictures, which is not a common thing for a lot of these papers to have. So that was entertaining because one of these pictures actually came up not 2 hours after I'd finished this paper on Kava forums. So it was a very timely thing to read. I've actually been going back and forth with Dr. Baker, and he'll hurt me for saying Dr. Baker, but this is formal. I want to keep it formal because we're speaking about him and his work, but I do
Yeah.
speak with Dr. Baker. This one's kind of closer to me in terms of the people that I've been around. I've actually drank Kava with Dr. Baker twice. And
What?
so this guy I actually connected with instantly because we immediately started talking about CYP inhibition. I sat down and was like, Dr. Baker. And the first thing he said was, don't call me Dr. Baker. I said, okay, what about this CYP inhibition? And we started talking about that just instantly when we sat down. And I couldn't not talk to him because I knew who he was and I knew that he had a lot to do with Kava and he'd written about it. Yeah, it was a very interesting meeting in Hawaii with him. This actually really
Yeah.
underscores a lot that he's talked about with me personally in the circles that we've had online. It echoes a lot of his sentiments in these papers. It was good to dig down into this and see how he writes. It's a good paper. In the first paragraph, I think it probably ought to just go ahead and address that. The first paragraph of this paper, still going on from 2012, Dr. Bittenbender puts together a little Kava circle after school on Fridays at 3 o'clock on campus or a little bit off campus or somewhere around really close to campus. They have a Kava circle there. They'll have anybody from well-known Kava experts to people just wanting to understand what Kava is. And it's spoken about here in the first paragraph. It says, 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, I seated on a stool in the back of the corner of the science lab at Manoa campus, the University of Hawaii. Several of the regulars are here, waiting for their Kava preparation to be complete. In Pompeii, Kava roots are pounded on basalt slabs that ring like bells, and the sound foreshadows the evening of Kava drinking. In Skip's lab, Kava Circle is announced with the sound of the Vitamix blender. We shout over the sound of the Vitamix to continue our conversations. The Kava is mixed with warm water and run through the blender twice. The water is strained out and the process is repeated 2 more times. The combination of all 3 extractions is then poured into a serving bowl from which the individual cups are scooped. I've talked to Dr. Bittenbender about that process, and they do use warm water. They use body temperature water. That is for fresh Kava. He'll use 1 pound of Kava to about 2 gallons of water, and that's their ratio. Fresh Kava, and
That's strong.
it's strong.
Okay.
Yeah,
A pound of fresh Kava. Okay. Okay.
pound of fresh Kava, and that's about 2 gallons of water. They blend it twice. They're probably getting it way stronger than we normally drink.
I just have to say that, yeah, this is an excellent paper. I really enjoyed reading it. That first paragraph threw me for a surprise because most academic papers published in journals start off with an abstract and it's often in italics. But this like really sets the scene. It's like a anecdote. He's describing this experience that he had. He's showing how all of these different ways of preparing kava are kind of converging in this lab at the
Mhm.
University of Hawaii. Really like the perfect introduction to this paper. And I just have to say to Dr. Jonathan D. Baker that you are an excellent writer because I read this whole thing in one sitting and enjoyed every moment of it. It's an excellent paper.
Yep. This one took I read this between phone calls at work, and it definitely captured my attention.
I looked up Dr. Baker and I was surprised that he's a professor of biology, I believe, or he has his PhD in biology. Because when I was reading this paper, I was thinking that he was an anthropologist because he was using a lot of social science language and talking about ethnographic methods. So I was surprised to find out that he was a biologist. That's cool. That shows that he's cutting across disciplines, which is something that's much needed in the academic world.
Definitely. And he's a plant guru. When we were in Hawaii, he walked by me with a bag and he says, someone just brought me these. And he holds it up and it's these mushrooms the size of which I'd never ever seen before. And I was just like, oh, okay. So it was just like he loves what he does. And I think he lives what he does because even at that time, people were just like, hey, can you ID these? So even when he's walking around with people and know what he's good at, and they seek him out for his profession. I think I'll talk about how the paper is written. It's broken down in 5 sections. There's the first section is called background cross-cutting soups. The second section is called From Portion to Pill, Kava as a Pharmaceutical Analog. The next section is called Buzz in a Bowl, Recreational Kava Use. The one after that is called Brownies, Chocolate, and Soda, Kava's Food Forms. And finally, the fifth one is The Future of the Kavascape. In the introduction section, the one part that captures my attention was the phrase where he says, Kava is undergoing a transformation into an alcohol like recreational analog. We've been speaking about that for a long time. And this has been something that
Yep.
I deal with moderating on our Kava on Reddit is everyone coming to Kava looking for a substitute for alcohol. And I thought that was very interesting that he pointed that out at the beginning because it is a fact that there are a number of people that come to it that way. And it is also presented in that fashion in a lot of bars in South Florida and North Florida and Middle Florida, all of Florida, that it is put forth as a recreational analog to alcohol. And there's good and there's bad in that, but we'll continue to get into this. Do you have anything to say about the introductory part, Doug?
Yeah, I want to react to that because I know that there's a whole section in the paper about that topic, but I do think it's a very shrewd point and very well stated and argued throughout the paper. The word analog is very key to that sentence because he's talking about kava being something that can be used recreationally in lieu of alcohol, which is healthier, kind of pro-social, and doesn't have the damaging addictive side effects of alcohol. I think that right off the bat, he's really highlighting the benefits of kava and kava's role in kind of social scenes in different parts of the country. And I think to some extent, our community online, our kava community, sees kava that way. We mostly drink it recreationally. I don't think any of us drink it in a kind of ritual way. It's more of a social activity. He starts off really on the right foot with the statement. I do want to talk a little bit about the opening part before we get to the background because he actually lays out what his argument is. It's a really great argument. He's talking about in this paper the way that Kava, and this is the me speaking here, I'm not quoting him. He's talking about the way that Kava has changed over time and how there's no such thing as traditional. And this is a very in the kind of the realm of anthropology. The word traditional is like a very taboo word in a way because nothing is static. Everything is changing at all times, whether it's Kava or Christianity or computers, whatever it is, it's changing at all times. So there's actually never a moment where you can freeze something in time and say, this is the traditional way of doing things. And he really finds the support for that argument throughout the paper. The first part of the paper really sets that up really well. I think it's important for people to understand it. If when you open this paper and you read it, that's really the argument that he's making is that Kava has changed over time. The way that Kava is consumed has changed over time. And there's no good or bad in things changing or the way that you prepare Kava. If it's not the same as how ancient Vanuatu made it, you're not committing a great crime. And I think that it's a point that needs to be made, and he makes it really well.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. You made a great point on that one. And I believe that actually was one of the first things that I highlighted that kind of just bled right into the background cross-cutting scapes. Perfect. And it says that kava can be thought to exist on a continuum from traditional to non-traditional in terms of form and use, as well as associated knowledge. I think this is very interesting. This part of it brings to something we've been dealing with for a good bit on terms of what is traditional. And just what you were saying, so in between, there are various stages where understanding of kava are a mix of both traditional and non-traditional. Thus, a simple traditional non-traditional dichotomy is too simplistic. And I think that's what he's suggesting there is that when kava arrives at whatever location, and I believe he even says this verbatim, that it takes on whatever qualities that society imbues it with. So it just morphs into what it needs to be for them. Did you want to say anything about that portion there?
I would just, yeah, I would add that when I read that part of the paper, I was very happy and excited because kava is a plant and it's an agricultural product and doesn't within itself contain any meaning, right? So it's the people that drink kava that imbue it with meaning and substance. And as kava moves from culture to culture, it takes on new meanings. It's a really powerful, poignant point that he's making. One that I think the whole kava community could learn from. So yeah, no, I just want to give 2 thumbs up to Dr. Baker for making that excellent point. Yeah.
Right on. Agreed. Same. And then it goes on to talk about novel comestibles, which are consumables. are to a large extent interpreted through the lens of the culture into which they have been introduced. And that's exactly what I was just about to say. I just said a minute ago, they says it verbatim, and there it is. Though the substance can be readily moved from one place to another, the associated meanings and practices are not inherent to the object. Cultural,
Mhm.
social information is less evenly transmitted than the substance themselves. So I think that that core there, that kind of truly sums up what I believe he's trying to say. You can move a substance, it can do the same things, but it will not be interpreted in the same way. Through the lens of culture is what he's saying, is that they will be interpreted. So however it arrives to us, and it will take its form through our eyes. So I thought that was very poignant. Right.
And I was going to add that he uses this word that is very interesting to me, indigenization. And he talks about the way that different plants and even medicines, even synthetic medicines are indigenized into local ethno medical systems. So that's really a cultural process where a logic is created to merge that medicine into the local context. And I think it's really important if you pull back 30,000 feet and you look down on this. Kava got to Europe and looked at it as this potential pharmaceutical, right? So they were able to extract kava lactones, put them into pill form, and then prescribe it as a medicine for anxiety. And that is a form of indigenization. So meaning that they're taking something that's traditionally consumed elsewhere and they're turning it into this pill form, which makes cult sense to people like us who go to the doctor and get prescriptions for different medications. I just think that's like such a cool way of thinking about it is we get Europeans, Westerners, we're like really obsessed with measurements and like milligrams and how much of this should I take per day? What's the daily dosage? People in Fiji and Vanuatu, when they prepare kava, they don't think about that kind of stuff at all. Like right from the beginning, we're kind of taking this traditional plant and presenting it to the public in a way that makes sense to them. So that's really the cultural lens that kava went through to make sense to people in Germany and the US. And I had never thought about it that way, but the way that he writes this here is just brilliant. So it's such a cool way of thinking about it. And he says pharmaceuticalization can be seen as the reciprocal process of indigenization. A substance consumed in some indigenous context is incorporated into the pharmaceutical context.
Yep.
So it's like the evolution of kava from being a traditional drink consumed out of a tiny group of people to being something that can be put in a pill bottle and, bought at the drugstore.
Right. And this is the vast majority of copper products sold in the Western countries fall into this category of dietary supplements, though a handful in Europe were developed into pharmaceutical grade single compound pills. Dietary supplements are typically less refined than pharmaceutical products, and I agree there. That's something that the United States needs to get a hold of and are governed by different regulations, if any. Plant materials incorporated into pharmaceuticals are reduced to chemical extracts, usually comprised of a single isolated compound. They are stripped of their botanical identity and are fully pharmaceuticalized. For the less refined botanical medicines, the process is actually quite similar, and they too are transformed to be more like pharmaceuticals. And the obvious transformation is form. Plant medicines are turned into capsules, pills, liquids, extracts, and others into Western medicines because it's familiar, like you were saying, it's familiar to the Westerner. Powdered form of kava has taken so long to catch on. It really has, because in the 90s and I mean, it's had decades to exist, and it hasn't been picked up in the United States, and it just started it here in the early 2000s. It's taken a while for powdered kava to come to our consciousness, where these other products we kind of flock to because it's in the health food store. You see the pills. Oh, my anxiety is high. Oh, my stress is high. This is great. I can do this without taking pills, without going to the doctor. I don't need a prescription. He does a great job at illustrating how it is repackaged from its original form into something that's more ingestible by the American society.
I just want to add, yeah, this is one of the challenges that I face when I talk to people about kava. Recommending kava to people who struggle with anxiety or are looking for a way to wind down at the end of a stressful workday. They'll send me a text message or they'll call me up and they'll be like, "Oh, hey, I went down to the health food store and I bought a bottle of kava capsules." And I'll be like, "Oh no, let me send
Close.
you some websites, some links. Like you have to make it you should make it with a dry powder, and that's really the only way it's gonna benefit you," and they get confused and give up. So it's just when I was reading this, I was like, "Oh god, I struggle with this issue all the time when I'm talking to people about kava." And people will go and spend like $30, $40 on a bottle of kava powder that's just in like pill capsules, and I'm like, yeah, that's not gonna do much for you.
Nope. And sometimes it will be just be rough cut kava in a pill or a
Yep.
micronized kava in a pill. So you're like, okay, there's 1 gram in that pill. How many grams of kava do you usually use in a session? Like 20. So yeah, that's a
Hmm.
lot of pills you're gonna have to be swallowing to equal up a standard kava session, what you would normally take. Now I realize that the micronized portion wouldn't be that much. And you can actually get away with it with micronized if you're looking for anxiety relief. But in terms of experiencing kava, having the full on feelings, knowing it, feeling it, appreciating it's going to require the real deal. And I know people want to say, what about extracts and everything? But truly, it requires the real deal. There is something different about extracts. We don't know what it is. We don't know what causes it. We think that maybe, yeah, I say we don't know what it is, but I think that there's a portion of kava that's not extracted by solvents that is key to the kava's experience. Like, I think that there's something that it doesn't grab and pull out. But back to the paper, we were talking about pharmaceuticalization. And then after he talks about pharmaceuticalization, which he defines as the process of non-pharmaceuticalized being introduced into a pharmaceutical dominated Western medical system. He goes on to speak about the parallel to this being the parallel of this process of pharmaceuticalization is the notion of recreational. And this is where we go into our second term in this section, recreational drug, or this is the third because the first one was immunization, then pharmaceuticalization, and now recreationalization. And Dr. Baker defines this process of recreationalization as referring to the incorporation of a substance into the context of recreational use, which is obvious. He says recreational drug use itself is a problematic concept fraught with cultural assumptions and value judgments that cannot be addressed in full here, which I agree because we'd have another 5 hour conversation about that. Recreationalization is meant to be a descriptive term for the process by which something is translated into a context of use primarily focused on inducing intoxication or inebriation. So it's saying here is it's taken from the medical form, and now we're going into what we would consider the Kava community form, like our recreational use. This is where I would like to focus more on the recreational side of it, because I think that when we focus on it too much as a drug, as an actual therapy for some sort of condition, it draws too many people thinking that they can solve everything with it because it's a drug. And that's not necessarily how Kava works. I like talking about it in this context. So it's good. It was good to read through this. And he talks about other plants that have been subject to these same effects, like coca, where it was originally just chewed by the inhabitants. And after it was extracted, concentrated, and everything, you get cocaine. And he also talks about salvia divinorum and talks about other soft drugs like coffee, tea, and chocolate, which once removed from their traditional context and modified, they become popular in the society in which they're introduced. So it is interesting to see how Kava did suffer from the same sort of treatment, especially in the 90s.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here really quick because when we first started jumping into the paper, you quoted part of it where he was talking about an alcohol analogy, and this is exactly what he was talking about was the recreationalization. He talks pretty extensively about cut chewing, which is a plant that grows in Ethiopia and the highlands of Ethiopia. And I've actually worked in Ethiopia for 3 years, and I chewed cut with the local folks there. Yeah, it's one of those things that it is part of the culture. It's a lot like a methamphetamine. It gives you like a lot of energy and it reduces your appetite. And then yeah, like tobacco. Tobacco was this like really sacred plant to Native Americans and used mostly in kind of ritualistic ceremonies to mark power structures and things. But then it turned into this recreational kind of substance people would use in social settings. And I think that the comparison to Kava is really apt. So I do believe that Kava has been used recreationally in the Pacific Islands for hundreds, if not thousands of years, not only just for ritualistic purposes. But yeah, I think it's an interesting way of drawing the parallel between the pharmaceuticalism and the recreationalization of Kava and showing how those two processes have happened here in the United States and Europe simultaneously parallel to each other. And they mean two different things, but they've both undergone a process that can be understood as part of our cultural context. And really, again, like just a really great presentation of this information in the paper.
I have it highlighted here. He says Kava, as is discussed here in all the cases, Kava is treated as an analog to something else already in use. It's seen like something else, and that association shapes how Kava is perceived, adopted, and transformed. And I think it sums up him talking about the analog to alcohol. And there's so many people that will analog it to so many different things. That's the first thing someone asks on these platforms that we moderate is what is it? What does it feel like? What can I compare it to? It's truly one of those things where you have to experience yourself. You're not going to see your ancestors, unlike Dr. Turner would think. It's something very subtle and something that you have to experience yourself before you can truly understand it. And there's a lot of people that say, oh, it's like benzos or alcohol. I mean, it's not really. It's on its own level. And that's but I think that
So
actually
Jimmy, why don't you jump into the why don't you jump into the next section on the from potion to pill? Because I know this is a topic that you're very passionate about. And so I'll let you I don't want to steal your thunder on this one.
oh, man, you can that's well, we've got plenty of papers to discuss. There's plenty of thunder to be had, so I'm not worried
Yep.
about that one bit. But, and it says, Kava's most profound change in terms of context, location, form, and use is its full transformation into a pharmaceutical analog in Western countries. This section describes Kava's pharma form and briefly discusses the details and how it's used. So he talks about Kava being like a supplement to the industry. It says, by contrast, dosage consistency of Kava beverage. Okay. And in this section, he speaks about how it's very difficult to transfer from a pill to a cup of Kava. It's a difficult thing for us to say when you're drinking Kava, you're getting this many milligrams. And he says the point is that in comparison to Kava supplement users, most Kava drinkers are not assessing their consumption in terms of the milligrams of Kava lactones they're consuming. And that's true. But I hear a lot of Kava drinkers ask, how many Kava lactones am I drinking in my Kava? So it is a question, but it's not a common question. I'll just say it's an online question. He also says while botanicals are approaching the standards of pharmaceuticals, they have not entirely reached them. And he's being very generous there. In that sense, then, standardization might carry more symbolic weight than what is warranted based on the existing variability. And standardization is a big thing in these supplement industries and making sure that whatever you say it is on the bottle is what you're getting and it remains that and it doesn't change. Kava is a very herb. It can change based on its genetic makeup, based on where you purchase it from, based on how old it is, based on what part of the plant is being used most predominantly. So it is a very difficult thing to actually standardize. And he speaks about the liver incident in the early 2000s, late 90s. And that's kind of still of a stain that we deal with. And the rationale for Kava use was also entirely transformed from potion to pill stage. It turned into a pharmaceutical and was actually prescribed as a prescription drug there in Germany and Switzerland.
Yeah, one of the things that stuck out to me is he talks at length here about how these studies were done that compared the effects of kava with benzodiazepines and showed that kava can produce some of the same relaxing effects as benzodiazepines. And that was the logic that underpinned its prescription as a anti-anxiety drug. So truly, it wasn't just like oh, we heard about this herb, we're gonna put it in capsule form and then sell it to the public as a way of relieving anxiety. It was actually like the scientists and pharmacists were whoever I don't know what the title of is of people who develop medicines. I guess they're
Pharmacologist.
yeah. They did these studies comparing the effects of kava to benzodiazepines, and they were sufficiently pleased with the results enough to actually develop a prescription alternative to benzodiazepines. But then the thing that stood out to me is after that discussion, he got into this really fascinating discussion about how the marketing of those kava pills, those prescription kava pills, was done with this traditional imagery, like pictures of the Pacific Islands or pictures of people from Papua New Guinea, which he joked that it was funny because
They don't drink it.
those people probably didn't even drink kava. Yeah. So yeah, the villagers that are on the bottles and the pictures of the trees, they create this marker of authenticity
Yes.
and exoticism
The exotic
that
other.
really makes the customer feel like, oh wow, I'm like taking this medicine. It's the traditional product of these wise islanders that have been consuming it for thousands of years. And in a way, they're right, but then in a way, it's also capitalizing off of the cultural roots of Kava in the South Pacific. And I just
Yes.
thought it was another really cool discussion.
Agreed. I have all this whole page highlighted. It says we go the extra 8,000 miles to find the kava that effectively promotes relaxation and relieves stress. So yeah, they totally do. They'll use the exoticism of kava being that different other at the outside other. What is kava? What is that? He says, I argue that this choice illustrates that a connection to actual present day cultural practices is less important than a connection to an implied or suggested tradition, through which consumers will hopefully, from Herb Farm's perspective, come to associate authenticity and efficacy with the product being marketed. So I think he even pokes a little bit at Herb Farm for their Papua New Guinea advertisement. And I thought that was a great little section.
One thing I wanted to point out was he ties this discussion back to the original discussion at the beginning of the paper about the word tradition, how these pharmaceutical companies are invoking the word tradition to convey a message of safety and efficacy. Westerners have this image of kind of natural therapeutics and herbs and traditional diets and things like that as being these pure, more healthy alternatives to modern medicine. So oftentimes these pharmaceutical companies will find something like Kava. This is where issues of biopiracy come up, where people start getting worried about people stealing the intellectual property of indigenous peoples and then making millions and billions of dollars off of it. What the literature considers biopiracy. But he's really like making the case here that, yeah, these pharmaceutical companies took this traditional herb, saw that it was successful at addressing some of these anxiety issues, and used that word tradition and used the kind of cultural context of the South Pacific to make their patients feel like they were getting something healthier than a benzodiazepine, which is true, but it's also using the tradition to using the kind of the traditional image to strengthen their sales pitch.
Yeah, it's commercial. Kava in farm form is significantly transformed in terms of space or locality as well as context of use. Root material is shipped to Western countries where it's processed into capsules, tinctures, and tablets. These value added products are in turn distributed throughout the world. It is possible, for example, to buy Kava supplements in Honolulu. The Kava goes full circle and returns to the Pacific after being transformed. I thought that was an interesting thing. You can buy a Kava extract in Honolulu. And that's where probably Kava started from, came back to you in that form. And it is interesting to see that. And that kind of leads us into our next portion of the paper, which is titled Buzz in a Bowl, Recreational Kava Usage. And the Kavasseur is the king of the recreational Kavasseur forms. I'll let him take it away on that one.
Yeah, I was a little bit disappointed that the Kavasseur blog was never mentioned in here, but no, I'm just joking. Yeah, so this part of the paper, one thing that stood out to me was he's talking about kava bars and the contemporary kava drinking scene in the United States and mentions specifically places like Florida, actually places that we know. He mentions actual kava bars that I've been to. But one of the really cool things that he does is he talks about how these kava bars tap into those traditions and the imagery associated with the South Pacific. If you listen to this podcast and you've been to a kava bar, you've probably seen a tiki god or a tiki idol on the wall, or you've seen some kind of imitation of a bamboo or something on the walls. That's all to make you feel like you're having this authentic experience. So one of the quotes is, in many of these contexts, there is an awareness of the traditions associated with kava, even if little of this knowledge is incorporated into the actual protocols of drinking. The purpose of consumption is largely consonant with less formal social consumption in Pacific Islander communities. So yeah, he calls this like quasi-traditional consumption. And we see this all the time online and on the Facebook Kava group and on the Kava forums where people are hosting these Kava ceremonies in different Kava bars in Georgia, Florida, all over the place where they're sitting around with a tanoa and they're drinking Kava and they're talking about Fiji, they're talking about Vanuatu, and they're trying to represent the traditional consumption of Kava, kind of make people feel like they're part of this traditional history, but they're definitely not getting it right. You know what I mean? When you go to a kava bar in Florida and you sit around a tonneau and you drink kava and you talk about your feelings or you like wave crystals around or whatever, that's not traditional kava consumption, but it's presented as such. So like these kava bars definitely tap into the traditional aesthetic of kava without actually really achieving a one-to-one kind of replication of the ceremony. And I think Dr. Baker would agree that there is no such thing as a traditional kava ceremony. So in a way, they're not really committing any great crime, just doing their best to probably help people out and give them an authentic kava experience, but B also have a successful business.
And
So
some of them are just straight silly.
Yeah, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being silly.
Yep. And one of the parts that I highlighted really close to where you're talking about is it says, despite the partial continuity, there are important differences between traditional and quasi traditional consumption. The lack of formal protocols or ceremonies associated with drinking is the primary difference. That means that the quasi traditional consumption is just you and your friends around a Tanoa talking. And that
Yep.
is as traditional as it needs to be put forth. But that is still a change from what we see that kava bars are doing. It's a complete mirroring of the bar in the actual alcohol industry where you're served at a bar, you drink your one drink or your shell, and you yell bula or you get another one, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of them are not conducive to that environment. I can't say that overall that everyone is not, because there are quite a number of bars that do take this into account and will provide this space for people to do this or do it themselves. And I'd like to give credit to them. But overall, most of the bars we see and we see talked about are the ones that you find in head shops, don't typically completely sell kava. Yeah, they sell vapes and THC products, kratom, everything else. So that's the kind of thing that I'm not sure how we get across that it's not traditional, but that's another story. That's another topic. But I thought that was a great spot in there. And he's talking about the lack of formal protocols. I don't truly know the formal protocols. I've seen it, but I wouldn't know how to do that myself, and I wouldn't know how to tell anyone how to do that.
And that would just be one iteration of the protocols too. That's
Right.
back to his original argument. There is no way of conducting a kava ceremony. It's changed over time. It continues to change. And it depends on whether you're in Samoa or Fiji or Tonga or Vanuatu. Like all those kava ceremonies are going to look different. So it's okay, which one would you follow if you did decide to do it authentically? It's a super interesting discussion. And then he goes on to talk about, again, the analogy to alcohol. And I think you could have gone a little bit more into this, but he talks about how I argue, this is a quote, I argue that in the kava bars in Hawaii, as well as those in the continental United States, kava functions as an analog for alcohol consumption. It is still a social beverage, but the norms of social interaction are to some extent akin to what would be seen in a bar serving alcohol. Furthermore, I suspect that this is more pronounced in kava bars on the continent than in those in Hawaii.
Yep.
And I think that's a really good point. I think that in the continental United States, if you grow up in a kind of normal American family, traditional middle class family, you're probably going to college, hitting the bars, and getting blackout drunk with your friends. That behavior continues until you realize that you're destroying your body and your mind.
Till it
And
hurts.
then kava can mimic that environment and that social setting to some extent. I've been to these kava bars and they work wonders for people. They keep people sober, they give people community, they provide a lot of good things for the patrons. And it is similar to alcohol because it's an alternative to alcohol. Kava bars are alternatives to alcohol bars. And then I think that at the end of the day, this isn't a paper about addiction or about kava being better than alcohol or kava being the solution to alcoholism. But at the end of the day, for a lot of people, kava has become just that, a solution for their addiction issues, a way to get their lives back on track and away from self-destruction, basically.
Agreed. Yep. And that's how I came across kava. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I have a little spot below where we were just talking and where it says the farther removed recreational consumption is from the Pacific, the less informed it is by actual historical and present day kava drinking practices. And I thought that was insightful in terms of the way that's exactly right. The further away it goes from its homeland, the less informed it is by the actual historical and present day kava drinking practices. This makes sense. And it's taken time. Kava has made it here before the real kava information had. We didn't know
Yep.
what we were doing and we didn't know how to address kava or how it was supposed to be consumed because all we were presented with is bags of powder. How do you go about this? And that's the first question most people ask is, okay, I got the powder, I got the strainer. What's next? What do I do? A different sort of paradigm for Americans to have to brew up a kava beverage to drink for an effect. It's a hard sell, but obviously we exist. So there are people that will take to it and it is a positive thing for them. But yeah, and this is where he talks about the all bus pass from the Hale Noa and
Yeah.
where if you can get your free Tanoa once you drink enough shells or something like that.
Sounds good to me. Man. Yeah.
Yep.
I was gonna say really quick on that note about the difficulty of accessing and understanding kava. I think people like you and I take it for granted because we've been drinking kava for so long. But I remember when I first started ordering kava online and preparing it, I was super intimidated.
Yeah.
And I think that is still the experience of a lot of people that come to Kava.
They get this bag in the mail and they get this strainer with the bag, but it's still like, how much of this do I use? And like people like you and I think we get so tired of hearing questions like that we stop answering them. So I guess we just let other people answer them who
Yeah.
are on
Yep.
the forum. But it is very intimidating because you're like, you don't know what it's gonna feel like, you don't know how to prepare it, and you don't know like the basics, how to brew up a shell of kava. I just always try to remind myself that this is not something that I've always known how to do.
And he talks about here, and I thought this was pretty funny, about how it comes full circle again, where an individual was making a Kavanilla shake using gel caps and ice cream. So they were mixing up 20 to 30 gel caps in their ice cream with a couple shakes of cinnamon, some vanilla extract, and blend for about 5 minutes. We went full circle and came back around, and they're trying to make drinks out of the extract pills. It's funny how we come back to the way that kava was consumed the whole time. We go away from the capsule, away from the extracts, back to traditional kava prep. Like at first we were all into the paradise kava extracts, all the extract drinks and all the every extract you could find. Let's try that. And now we find more value in the powdered kavas than we ever had in the extracts. Yeah, there's some of them taste pretty good. The extract from paradise kava called, what was it, coconut vanilla something, but
Oh man.
it was like eating numbing ice cream. It was just a different thing, and it really, honestly, I'm not sure I really got that much effect off extracts, maybe a little bit of headiness. Going back to the paper here, he says the boundary between recreational drug use and the consumption of kava foods is fuzzy, and it is one of the issues looming on the horizon with respects to kava and kava marketing. He's Nostradamusing this stuff right now because we're dealing with some pretty serious issues where people are calling their products kava, and they are at best a minority kava. And at worst, it is usually some extracted plant material that is very addictive. And they're trying to sell the product under the guise of it being a pure kava product. Kava is great to be euphoric. Feel free to have a kava shot, if you can read between the lines there. But yeah, it is a big threat to our industry right now, and how that this recreational drug and consumption of food is being blurred. And especially if we have people that are saying, use this shot to increase the energy in your day. This is the best functional drink. And it's just not, it needs to be divorced of those sort of things. Kava deserves more respect than to be jammed into a bottle with some addictive substance that totally changes the nature of the entire beverage. That is not kava. Don't even put the names, put kava lactones in there. It's not even kava. It doesn't even have actual kava in it. It's just kava lactone extracts. I have a lot of opinions about that specific topic, but I digress.
Completely agree with you. I think that it is a huge problem that we're facing. And again, yeah, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how kava is very intimidating. When you get your bag of kava in the mail, you don't know what to do with it. So people are tempted to buy these little shots or little kava products that have kratom mixed in with them and caffeine mixed in with them and crazy high doses of vitamin B or whatever the hell people want to mix with their kava. And yeah, it's those people might walk away from that experience saying, "Oh, I took kava and I got really sick," or "I've been taking kava and I got really addicted to it."
Yep.
And the public doesn't know any better than to just accept what they're saying. They don't know that there's a way of consuming kava that is just kava. So it's a really important point, and it can't be said too much. If we repeat that point on every podcast that we record, we will be doing a service to
Yes.
kava because it's such an important point.
Absolutely.
And people need to know that if they're buying kava in a bag and they're putting it into a sieve and they're putting it in water and they're making a water aqueous kava drink, then they're doing it right and not getting anything else except for kava and water.
That's right. That's all you need. The codex defines kava as water and root particle mixed together and strained. And that's when we say kava, that's what we mean. Anything outside of that is technically a kava lactone product, an extract product. You wouldn't want to call the pills that are in the bottle kava. It gives the wrong impression that that's kava in a pill. No, those are kava lactones crammed into a pill. Kava is an experience. Kava is a plant. Kava is a drink. It is
Yep.
not these pills. It is not these kava lactone extract beverages. It's not these shots. And that's where we always come back to is that the traditional consumption or that's the traditional consumption, but just the way of consuming kava as defined by the codex. I guess we could say that or traditional has the same
Right.
exact meaning. But I think that kind of leads us into our next section titled, and this was really interesting to read, Brownies, Chocolate, and Soda, Kava's Food Forms. And this actually brought back a lot of memories because, and I actually, through this paper, I copied one of the images and sent to the creator because I knew one of the guys that, and you do too, but one of the guys that made one of the products in the next section. And I was like, hey man, what is this? And he explained to me what it was and how it was made and everything. But yeah, this whole section was very interesting. He talks about how they went through different iterations of tests to see what they could find, anything that could cover the taste of kava. And they went through brownie smoothies. They had made kava butter, kava batter used to coat foods before frying, ginger flavored kava extracts, drinks, kava bread. They had Bloody Marys with kava in it, mustard,
Oh,
muffins, pastry, popcorn, and chocolate. So he had so many different things that they tried to cover the taste of kava with. And I was actually speaking with him last night. He said that every one of those was terrible. Everyone was just awful. And of course, in the paper, he tries to be nice and it's like, they weren't that great. But he said that it turns out that kava lactones have a flavor and kava lactones have a minimum effective amount. So you have to have a certain amount of kava lactones in eating to actually provide an effect. And that amount turns out that you can't hide in any sort of food product without still being able to detect the kava lactone flavor, that unique and sometimes off-putting flavor that people don't necessarily flock to, but is a common flavor in kava, but that's the kava lactones. But yeah, he tries all these different things and he talks about Dr. Bittenbender has made a kava java mixture with coffee and kava. But yep, I'll let you talk for a minute, Doug.
I just first want to respond to the kava coffee combination. There's nothing in the kava world that I've despised more than kava coffee combinations. I think that's because of the psychoactive effect, the synergy of kava and coffee. They just don't go well together. I'm sorry. Like, apparently some people like it, but like for me, coffee and kava, like really, they don't even cancel each other out. They create like a ball of anxiety in my brain. So
Yeah.
I've never understood it, but anyway, you do you, people. So when it comes to these kava products, these kava lactone products, as you very nicely called them,
Hmm.
I'm not a fan. And I've made no secrets about the fact that I don't take kindly to these like milk cocktails and kava chocolate fusions and kava popcorn sounds absolutely terrible as well. Batter, bread, come on, like sounds like a terrible way to get your kava. Just accept the fact that kava tastes the way that it tastes. And remember that when you drink kava, it's going to affect your taste buds for the next like 30 or 40 minutes.
Yep.
And that pepperiness, I happen to like the flavor of kava
Weirdo.
by itself. I know I'm one of those weirdos. I happen to like the flavor of kava by itself, but I have never had anything except for kava candies, the kava extract that Paradise Kava sold, which was the best I've ever had. And then some of the kava ritas and stuff like that that are made from the kava lactone extracts. But that's really masking the flavor of the kava to the point where you're getting the kava lactones, but it's so far removed from kava itself.
This is where he brings up the pictures and he talks about the Kona Coast chocolate. And he actually says the worst combination was the chocolate and kava. It ruined the quality of the taste of both. And he said it didn't do much of anything. And if the kava content was high enough, the
Yep.
food content numbed the mouth and tastes bitter and earthy no matter what. If it tastes good, the kava content was probably low. As implied by some of the quotations here, kava's flavor is an acquired taste for Westerners, and it truly is. It's like you were saying, you like the taste of kava. I am not in that camp. I have never once like really truly warmed up to that flavor. When Dr. Apple made it in Circle, I drank that and I didn't have any sort of like terrible visceral reaction like I do when I drink my thick paint when I at night before I go to bed. There is a big difference between stupidly concentrated kava and kava consumed at amounts that are somewhat more traditional and lower and more diluted. When I place some of my judgments on its flavor, they are quite augmented by its concentration. So that's always with me when it comes to flavors, always take that bit of salt with it because when I drink kava, it's always extremely concentrated. So there's never something that I find pleasant about that flavor. But hey, you know what? I don't complain about it. I'll sit there and I will cuss at my sink, my backsplash, but I will remember that Kava was consumed against basically the removal of culture by missionaries in Vanuatu, and it signified a turn against the missionaries. And I'll drink it harder. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, I don't care. The flavor doesn't even faze me at that point, because I get to think about how awesome it is, because Kava has that deep history that it's too cool to worry about the taste. You're drinking history here, and it's actually reducing your anxiety and stuff. And just don't complain about the muddy flavor. Just take it for what it is. And it's just part of the experience. Kava, you roll with all Kava gives you. You're not taking from Kava. Your Kava is graciously lending you part of itself for the time being. And some days it might be a lot, and some days it might not be much at all. But it's just the way it rolls. To go back to the paper, he says that he was talking about Ava 2.0, which was a product by Ozia. And that's made by a gentleman that both Douglas and I know personally. His name is Steve. He had made a Kava extract beverage. He told me it was the 30% extract. You add some lecithin. You hit it with a high shear immersion blender, then add some ginger for flavoring and some sugar. It's not that complicated, but he created a extract drink that won the taste contest in Hawaii for one of the Hawaii Kava conventions.
Why did he stop? Because that sounds pretty good to me.
Honestly, did. I would try it, but I'm pretty sure he stopped because of logistic issue, like most people do when they sell bottled Kava.
Yeah.
It's just hard to sell bottled Kava and be somewhat affordable in shipping large glass bottles or plastic bottles. It's not.
That makes sense.
And it'd have to be some sort of topping that were like super concentrated or something, where it was just one bottle would be enough for 40 uses. I'm not sure, but he speaks about some other products in here that I think I've seen in the past. One was Mary Jane's relaxing soda. I'd say 10 or 12 years ago. I remember drinking some of that thinking, oh man, when's it going to kick in? It didn't do anything, of course, but it was another one of those things they tried and it failed. And he talks a lot about things that try and fail. Here's one that I saw, and I spoke about this at the beginning of the podcast, that on page 255, there's an image of traditional Hawaiian teas. It says 100% certified Hawaiian. And it says ingredients list, 100% all natural, Big Island grown Hawaiian Ava leaf and lemongrass. So it's a tea of Kava leaves and lemongrass. And this product actually showed up on Kava forums not 3 hours after I finished reading this paper. Someone in Hawaii posted and says, is this safe to drink? So point very timely. And maybe we will have a podcast on PNG usage of Kava at some point, because that's another topic that could be a very good deep dive into the leaf consumption of Kava. But he talks about that, and he shows a picture of some sort of Kava sexual enhancer that was found at a hotel. And it's interesting.
It's a Chinese. Yeah.
Yep. I think, go ahead, Doug.
I was just gonna say that it was a Chinese product that was sold in China, and I guess that they were advertising it as a sexual enhancer. I feel like in China, like a lot of extracts, supplements, things like that, they claim that they're beneficial for sexual performance.
There's no research to confirm that.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
There might be research to confirm the opposite, actually. So don't take that to the bank. Here's where Dr. Baker talks about the word tradition, as it is frequently used in popular culture and narratives, suggests behavior or beliefs from the past that have a stable form. And here's where you were talking about how traditional doesn't stay static. That's like saying computer and using a reference from 92. We have to continue to stay constant with things, and traditional takes different forms and changes over time. And here he says traditional likewise is problematic as an adjective. In addition to implying a fictional stability for cultures, it also alludes to the continued discourse about human societies ranked on a continuum of development. Traditional cultures are juxtaposed with modernity, sometimes being traditional is portrayed as positive, where other times traditional societies are characterized as backwards or primitive. The word traditional, it could be a double-edged sword. It can be used for good and bad.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point here because you can use all kinds of analogies like computers and tobacco or whatever, but just Kava itself. Like when you read the history of Kava use in Vanuatu, when you hear about how it was consumed in the pre-colonial period, and then you learn about the colonial period where people were these evangelical colonial forces and occupiers were forcing people to stop drinking Kava and claiming that it was like the devil's root or whatever. So there was many years where people didn't drink Kava, And those traditions, those rituals that Kava was associated with in Vanuatu were disrupted. And then in the post-independence period, they revitalized Kava as a way of like national unity to show that this is part of Ni Vanuatu. We drink Kava. This is part of our culture. That's that example in and of itself proves the point that Kava consumption doesn't have a static traditional pattern that it follows. It's like he uses this language. Overwhelmingly, social science argue that traditions are performative, dynamic, and subject to reinterpretation and strategic reconfiguration based on present political and social contexts. That's exactly what that example demonstrates, is how there was a way that kava was consumed before the colonial period, and there was a way that it was consumed after the colonial period. I'm sure before colonizers came to the New Hebrides, Vanuatu, they weren't like, oh, drinking kava is like a core part of our national identity. Nobody was thinking that way. It was they lived in villages. They didn't really have an idea of what a state was, what a nation was. And then after the independence, they reimagined the role of kava in society and created these new traditions. So it's really like you can just look at kava itself and the history of kava to show how that's happened, even in the most traditional heartland of kava. Vanuatu is where kava comes from. The people in Vanuatu have created new meaning and new rituals and new traditions around kava. So really just drives that point home like really eloquently.
Agreed. I believe that kind of sums up and it leads us to the end of our paper here. He says that it is well worth considering the impact these trends might have on the future of kava in the various contexts in which it's consumed. And I have to agree with him 100%. We are considering those and the impact that they're having, and we're watching the impact that they're having. We have opinions about the impact it's having, and so does a lot of other people. You can just come on Facebook and see the opinions people have about the impact it's having. But I thought this paper was excellent. I really thought this was a timely paper, even though it's written in 2012. It's still very applicable today. We have current examples of everything he's spoken about, and we are still fighting some things that he was alluding to. So it's a very insightful paper in terms of how he basically predicted what was to come. But it is interesting to watch this stuff from the perspective of being able to see its impact on the average user, the average consumer. But yeah, great paper. So I'll let you close it out, Doug.
Yeah, I think you said it all. And Dr. Baker, yeah, as you said, 2012. When I started reading this, I got halfway through it, asked myself, when was this written? And I was surprised because it feels like it was written like 3 years ago or 2 years ago. It's so on point in this moment that we're experiencing with Kava right now. He says it all right here. And I would encourage everybody to check out this paper. There's more to it than what we discussed. He talks about how Kava traditions are different, like with Australian Aborigines and people in the Solomon Islands.